thank you for tuning in. I'm Kerri Barber with Progressive Insider, and I'm delighted to bring to you an interview with someone who has some really great points and an interesting way of looking at where we are now as progressives with policy and the direction of the country. So I'd like to introduce you to Miss Amira Napier. Amira, welcome.
Thank you, Kerri. I'm really happy to be here and have this discussion with you today.
We so appreciate it. And part of our goal here is to elevate these conversations and voices of just regular grassroots folks, because as we can see in Congress and the national spotlight, not everybody's got the right answer. And sometimes regular people who are in the trenches dealing with things actually have a better view. So this is why I reached out to you. You have a blog, and there were a couple of posts that I thought I'd like to kind of bring the spotlight to. First one was about looking at the situation we're in now under COVID, and do we really want some of the infrastructure and status quo back? And you brought up three major points. So it was healthcare, and then the political, racial disparity, and then the wealth disparity. So with these three topics, you went into great details. Let's get into the first one with healthcare on the backdrop of the pandemic. So share your thoughts on what it is that we are actually fighting for right now.
These are really great topics that I think are necessary for this current conversation. When it comes to healthcare, Medicare for All has been the overarching theme that we've seen discussed. I believe in some of the last polling that I saw, over 65% of the American population is interested in having an option that is for Medicare for all. Because as we're seeing right now with unemployment numbers being over 40 million people, because our system currently relates your healthcare to your job, these are now over 40 million people that by the end of this month are not going to have healthcare during a pandemic. And so it really shows the disparity that we have had in this country. And like you mentioned, it's not just happening right this moment. These are issues that have been happening in this country for as long as I can remember, of individuals having a really hard time being able to afford their health care. People aren't able to get some basic procedures that they may need. People are unable to pay for their medications. We have young individuals, 19, 20 years old, that are rationing their insulin for being in a country that claims to be a first world nation that wants to be this great country. I don't see how, especially right now, we can stay in an unsustainable future of healthcare that doesn't provide for basic medical care for every single person, regardless of their job, their race, their ethnicity, and their access to money. And I think that that's a really big, crucial component right now. We should have Medicare for all. I do not understand why politicians are thinking extending ACA benefits is going to help, and things like COBRA. Those types of premiums are still very costly, even if you have your employer that then provides you with a COBRA option. These are just unsustainable options, and I think it's time for a real conversation about taking the drastic step of creating a Medicare for all option.
It's interesting to me that you brought up the COBRA option, because while we have such a significant portion of Americans from both sides of the aisle who actually support Medicare for all, once they understand what that program actually is, the leadership itself has decided to subsidize insurance companies through these COBRA payments. And one of the things that I looked at under ACA, the cost savings under ACA comes from reducing payments to doctors and hospitals, not necessarily curbing the cost of care from the insurance company. So here we have COBRA, This balloon payment essentially is what it is for the insurance company that has actually nothing to do with care of the individual,
Mhm.
rather than just going to a Medicare for all. So, to your point, when we talk about access to healthcare, if you're unemployed, and even if the government says that they're going to pay for your COBRA payment, even under ACA, where our annual was not supposed to be, it was a zero at point of service coverage. Whereas now, when you go, if you even mention a new ailment or something like that, it gets coded differently. So you do have to pay for it. So do you see that similar kind of risk, even if they, kind of trot out a COBRA in this environment? We know it takes a long time, but with the COBRA payment, even if they promise it at 100% covered, do you still have those same concerns?
I do, because with COBRA comes a very bureaucratic system that, because it has been designed by politicians and policies that are meant to benefit the healthcare industry, they're not going, the way that it works, it's not going to benefit everyday individuals that are trying to utilize that service. And I think the other thing too that I'm sure you understand, but other people may not realize, is that you will pay your monthly premiums just to have that coverage. It doesn't mean that any of the care that you get, like you said, is going to be covered. You may mention, oh, I'm starting to hurt right here. And they may decide to code that differently to then bump up the cost of that visit. So instead of being 100% covered, you're now having to pay not just a copay, but you're also having to pay all of those extraneous fees that are coming from the administrative costs, the policy costs. And I think that that's the big part about especially COBRA that is just missed. It's not about, oh, we're going to help these people out if they've lost their job and they can still buy into insurance. They're buying into a just corrupt system. It is a system that has been built on profiting off of pain. And for the many different people I've met in the healthcare industry, the business industry, there's people that have faith values, human values. What I don't understand is, if you have those values, how can you create policies that are profiting off of someone in their most dire need? It boggles my mind, because we're supposed to be better than that. We're supposed to help those that are hurting. We're supposed to help those that are less fortunate. And that's why in European countries and in Canada, their healthcare systems are just that. It is helping those people. Now, there's of course different disagreements and arguments that will happen in those different areas based on the cost of taxes that people are paying, the extent of coverage, and things like that. And I don't want to dismiss those conversations that do need to be had. But I think for us here in the United States, we really need to have a concerted effort of pulling away from this very big corporate, big pharma, big healthcare industry, because it shouldn't be about making a profit for companies. It should be about helping people. That's why doctors go into it, and that's why nurses do it. And so I think we need to kind of come back to that viewpoint and start working with the Medicare system that does have different parameters in place to have caps on how much different, like how much costs are for different types of procedures, and having the same cost for prescription medications and things like that.
Well, I think you brought up a really good point about this disconnect. We call it cognitive dissonance, right?
Yes.
I want to kind of touch on going back to Congress, Congress and our states, right? So we as taxpayers, especially if you own a house or a business, and part of your property tax payment is going to fund platinum level insurance for everyone in your state house and everyone in Congress. At the same time, they're pushing us to for-profit insurance. And
Mhm.
so it goes with this continued disconnect that you mentioned about those who have a faith or morality code not actually applying it in practice to policy. So with
Yeah.
that, let's get into the next point that you brought up about racial disparity, because this again is another cognitive disconnect that we're seeing. There is no logical framework for bigotry or racism or any of these things when you're applying it to an entire swath of the country, your neighbors. So
Yes.
so you got into that in quite a bit of detail. And then when you and I spoke before, it was there was a personal aspect to it as well, if you don't mind sharing your own story.
Yes. So my background, I come from California. I was born in San Francisco, and I lived there for a few years. And then my family moved to a more rural part of Northern California, and we still maintained a lot of our connections and ties to the San Francisco area. So growing up, I was basically in these two different worlds. I was seeing a very conservative view and then a very liberal view, and for me, growing up with that difference, it definitely kind of kept me on the outside a little bit, not necessarily fully relating to my peers. And the experiences that I had were vast. I definitely dealt with my own issues with racism, bigotry, and people just kind of pointing at you because you look different, because you might think differently. And so growing up in that experience and kind of being in these two different worlds, it really shaped how I decided to move forward with my life. And that led me to go to college and study global studies, because I really wanted to understand, what is it about these differences that make us be so separated from each other? And it really did help to understand all the different cultures and religions, and how those different locations and the way that their culture is, how that builds their government, because it's the people that create the policies, and it's the people that implement the different views that they want for their countries and governments to operate, and whether they're going to be cooperative with their fellow neighbors or not. And so I definitely had a unique experience going into that. And when it comes to the racial disparity that we're seeing in this country, I certainly have not dealt with some of the very extreme things that we've been seeing over the last, I think it's like the last 2 weeks, 3 weeks, from the murder of George Floyd, of Ahmaud Arbery, and countless other names. I apologize that I can't remember all of them at this point. We are really suffering in this country, and it's very evident that there is a racial injustice that is happening. And I think from the protests that we're seeing around the country right now, from Minneapolis to Denver to LA to Chicago, people are feeling this. They are sick and tired, quite frankly, of police and other officials that have a position of power and using that power in a way that is being denigrating to a community and to a particular group of people. And as we're seeing, this is disproportionately pointed to people of color, and especially Black men, as we've seen. And so my heart goes out to everyone that is suffering right now, because we're dealing with racial issues, we're dealing with wealth issues, we're dealing with health issues. And I think people are just sick and tired of seeing their political leaders say one thing and yet do another. And that's what has been happening for way too many years when it comes to the political justice system. We have seen that there has been, I can't even remember some of my statistics at this point, but the number of Black men to white men that are imprisoned is astronomically higher, based off of the equal amount of whether it's the committing of crimes, drug use, and things like that. And just this morning, there was a CNN reporter during a live stream that was doing his job, had his press badge, and him and the rest of his crew was arrested. Whereas across the street, there was another press individual who was white with his crew, showed his badge, and the cops were like, okay, you're good. Like, That's fine. But then we have this individual over here who's not white that is being treated very differently. And I think that that's the conversation that really needs to be had. These are difficult conversations. They are not easy. And it really is going to come from the white community having to address the fact that there is racism. You can say that you're not racist, but we're seeing from too much evidence that there is. And people might not realize that they have it in a subconscious level, but they're acting consciously on that racism. And we're seeing that from police and things like that.
It's so telling that we're having this conversation today because I was part of my job. I have to monitor social media. And one of the things that was trending from the alt-right was the hashtag stage. So you brought up the CNN reporter and his entire crew, all four of them, who were arrested and then immediately released, within a few hours. But it does beg the question, you have all of these people who refuse to see the truth in front of them and went and decided that it's all staged, just like the Parkland shooting and everything else. So again and again and again, they refuse to see it. But one thing that I thought was interesting is you had also touched on wealth disparity and everything that was trickling up. So things that we cannot hide and we cannot manipulate into it's staged framework is the profit that have been made off of the suffering of people, particularly during this pandemic. So I was out pulling statistics, and they were saying that as of now, we have the unemployment, as you mentioned, 40 million people, but the Institute of Policy Studies said that taxes overall for millionaires has fallen by 79% since the 80s. And during just March and May of this year, wealth for millionaires and billionaires has gone up by 308 billion. At the same time, we see this fundamental loss of our economic structure for working class families. So part of this is what you touched on a few weeks ago in your blog, and here we see it now today. The numbers are coming in, and you were absolutely right. You were just predicting what we see today, and these are things that you cannot file away as just staged and manipulated the way that I'm just going to call them the alt-right. It keeps trying to do rather than see the truth of it. So this kind of leads me not just into your comments on wealth disparity, but then you also touched on as progressives, where do we go from here and where do we move forward? So with all of this, kind of encapsulate it for me and tell me what you think a true progressive should be focused on, digesting, going through, and then plan to move forward from where we are today.
That's a really good question. So thank you for posing that to me. Like I wrote in my piece about being a progressive, I think the really crucial thing right now that we need to have is we need to kind of come out of our shell a little bit. We need to get out of our ideologies that we're stuck into, and we need to start talking with one another. We might not see eye to eye on everything. I myself was a Democrat, but I did change my status to independent because I don't support what the Democratic Party is doing right now. I don't like the sensationalism, and I don't like the pushing of the divides that are going on in this country. We do have divides that make us have anxiety and at times, as we're seeing, this desire to be violent towards one another. And I think that the way to come back from that is to start having the conversation. And so for myself, what I've done is over the last 2.5 years, I have been watching news that 10 years prior, I wouldn't have let myself watch. I wouldn't have watched Tucker Carlson on Fox News. I didn't look at independent journalism like I do now on YouTube. That's definitely my go-to. And so I have decided to put myself in the uncomfortable place of looking at what other people believe? What do they think? Because I can't have a conversation and have a moment of, oh, we agree on something, if I don't put myself in the position of learning something else. And so I've looked at a myriad of different views on many different things. I've definitely looked at all of the conspiracy theories that people have when it comes to, like you said, oh, are they staging this CNN arrest right now? For me, it's important to understand, where are people getting their views? Because the more that I understand that, the better the conversation can be. And I also think that we need to stop with this, if you're a Democrat, you're right, and if you're a Republican, you're wrong, from the Democrat side, and vice versa for the Republicans. I think that's what's been missing. We have a lot more things in common than people realize. And especially right now, if anything, I hope that that's the positive that comes from this pandemic, that there's very few things that separate us. There's a lot more that brings us together. We want our family and friends to be healthy. We want them to be taken care of if they get sick. We want to be able to take care of ourselves in way of having a job and being able to afford the necessities in order to live. And I think that these are basics that seem to be missing from a lot of the discourse, and it really does come from mainstream media. And unfortunately, outlets like CNN, MSNBC, I even watched a clip last night from ABC News. The way that they were talking about the protests that were going on, I felt was very disingenuous to what the focus of that protest was. They were talking about the aftermath, and they were like, oh, it turned violent, and all of that stuff. And I watched the press conference that the mayor, Jacob Frey, I believe is how you say his last name, in Minneapolis. And he said that 99.9% of those protesters were being calm. They were being peaceful in displaying their frustration with their situation. And that was why I had the reaction that I did when I was watching that ABC News clip, because I'm like, I feel like you're trying to vilify what's happening right now. Where is your frustration towards a police officer who is supposed to be helping people, shimmying his knee onto the neck of a man until he died? Where is that outrage? And so that, I think, is what has been missing so much from mainstream media. Everyone has their opinions and they have the right to those, but they've lost, I think, the essence of what their job is supposed to be, which is reporting the news. We don't need conjecture. We don't need to have all of these pundits that give us their different viewpoints. We need to see, especially right now, what is happening in our country. What are the reasons why people are out in the streets, even though there's a pandemic? They're putting their lives at risk during a health scare. That should be admired. I look up to each one of those protesters. I don't want to be out there right now myself, but I'm definitely going to stand up and voice for the voiceless. And I think that that's what's missing so much from our discourse today, is too many of the people that represent this country are not being represented in the media. And they're not being represented in Congress, in the Senate, in the House. And there's such a disconnect. It almost feels like there's this aristocracy when it comes to politics, that you don't understand, we do our thing, let us do that, but we're going to screw you over here, and just don't say anything about it. So
excellent point. And we so appreciate that you are willing to take the time and join us on our independent network so that we can have these kind of conversations. And I hope that you will join us again, because I know that you're not done writing and you have so much more to say. So how can somebody find you and follow your work?
So my blog is called Endemic Times. So it's endemictimes.com. And I use that blog, like you said, it's my opinions, it's my viewpoints. I do try to provide research and statistics when I'm kind of going into that area. So you can find me at endemictimes.com. I'm also on Twitter. Amira Napier ET is my Twitter handle there. I've also started a Facebook page for my blog. It's definitely in its infancy, working out a lot of those different things that I don't know about, but this has been my passion for a really long time. I have a lot of opinions, and I just hope to move the conversation forward so that we can have more progressive policies that are working for the everyday person.
Excellent. Sounds great. And we love it here. So for everyone who tuned in today, thank you so much. And go check out Amira's blog and support her new page and help her get off the ground, because it is so important to have different viewpoints and different voices, especially those that are not manipulated by corporate dollars. So for Progressive Insider, I am Kerri Barber. Thank you so much for watching.